For 7 years, I lived with the guilt of having killed my own child, not with my own hands, not with an act, but by passing on my defective genes to him, like a death sentence imprinted in my every atom. For 7 years, I woke up with this knowledge and fell asleep with it, as if a cold stone had settled in my chest, impossible to warm with time or prayer. But everything changed the day the hospital called and showed me the CCTV footage, a murky video in which the truth was revealed, ready to tear apart everything I believed in. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to a person I had never suspected. My name is Amelia Fellini, and if someone had told me a week ago that my entire nightmare, all the pain I considered my own fault, was built on a lie, I probably would have laughed through my anger, considering it a cruel mockery. But here I am, sitting in my living room, in a chair with worn armrests, holding a court document in my hands, where the familiar words, genetic tragedy, are replaced by the terrifying, cold, first-degree murder. The call came on a Tuesday, an ordinary day. I was at work sorting returns at the bookstore where I've been working for 3 years. Returned books are like letters someone didn't finish reading, especially romantic ones, with shiny covers and promises of a happy ending that seemed like a joke to me. For 7 years, I lived knowing that my body, my genes, my family tree had killed my 3-week-old son, Noah. For 7 years, I heard Thomas's voice, my ex-husband, in my head. Your defective genes killed our child. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened, we need to know who we were before everything fell apart. I was 31 when I met Thomas Fellini. It happened at a medical conference in Chicago. I wasn't a doctor, not even a researcher. I was a librarian assisting the organizers with catalogs and presentations. Thomas was representing his pharmaceutical company, all successful and confident, with a perfectly tailored suit and a smile that made people's hands tremble. He had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room. His mother, Wanda, later called it the Fellini charm, as if it were a family privilege passed down through the blood, along with high cheekbones and a command of attention. You're not like other doctors, he said when he caught me shuffling journals between lectures. I replied that books don't argue, and he laughed, softly, warmly, sincerely. I didn't know then that I would later learn to distinguish the nuances of his laughter, the one of genuine amusement and the one of weaponry. He began courting me with an intensity worthy of Salesman of the Year. Flowers at the library where I worked, phone calls, short visits. On the way, he'd show up with a can of my favorite soup from the delicatessen, as if he knew I'd miss lunch that particular day. He even came over once to read to the preschoolers. His voice would come alive as he imitated characters from the books. The teachers laughed. The principal joked that people like him should be cloned. But not everyone was thrilled. When Thomas first brought me to the family estate, an old Victorian house with columns, too grand for ordinary people like me, Wanda greeted me the way students confident they'll fail greet an examiner. Her eyes slid over me as if searching for flaws that weren't immediately apparent. Amelia. Such a simple name, she said, drawing out the vowels as if tasting them. And you're a librarian? It's funny. Well, everyone has their own calling. Wanda was a woman for whom her husband's success had become a shell, and her last name a title. Every conversation with her was like an interrogation under the soft light of a chandelier. Thomas, of course, would say, "Don't pay attention, Mom's just worried. When we have kids, she'll soften." I wanted to believe. We married 2 years later. The wedding was like something out of a magazine. A country club, ice sculptures, a quartet playing classical music I didn't recognize. My family, ordinary people, felt out of place amidst this glitter. My sister Camilla leaned toward me and whispered, "Are you sure, BT? I think they think we're just entertainment." I just smiled, for I was sure I was in love. 6 months later, I found out I was pregnant. Thomas was beaming. His joy was so genuine that I thought, this is true happiness. Children's books appeared on the nightstand and in the bathroom, jars of vitamins neatly arranged by day of the week. Every morning he checked the app on his phone and reported, Week 16, our son is the size of an avocado. I would have reminded him it could have been a daughter, but Thomas, smiling his signature smug laugh, replied with unwavering confidence, "Fellini men have sons." He spoke as if he were pronouncing a law of nature that was impossible to disobey. 3 generations of firstborn boys, the pride of the family name, genetic destiny, as he liked to repeat. Back then, the word genetic sounded harmless, even scientifically beautiful, and I didn't know that it would become the curse of my life, a steel ring that would close around my heart. I sat with my palm on my stomach, feeling the gentle throb of new life beneath my skin, and believed that Thomas and I had a future ahead of us, smooth, reliable, like the line on a healthy heart's ECG. Wanda, of course, couldn't leave everything without her intervention. She insisted on early genetic testing as soon as she learned of the pregnancy. "Just in case," she said with an icy smile, "since your family history is so unclear." I felt embarrassed, ashamed, as if I were justifying other people's fates, though there was nothing shameful in my family. It's just that my parents were adopted, and that was done in the 60s, when all such records were classified and hidden under the confidential stamp. We never knew who our biological ancestors were, what diseases might be transmitted in our blood, and until we met Fellini, none of this seemed important. Back then, none of it mattered. When Noah was born, a little premature, tiny but amazingly perfect, with Thomas's nose and my eyes, I didn't think about any genes. He was perfect. His breath, soft as the rustle of paper, filled the room with meaning. We lived for exactly 11 days as a perfect family. Thomas would come home from work just after dark, throw his jacket on the chair, and without taking off his shoes, go into the nursery to hug his son. I often caught them together. He would whisper promises in his ear about future baseball games, about teaching him how to run a business, about building an empire for him. I would look at them then and think that happiness is simple. A man, a child, and a room filled with the scent of talc. And then came the 12th day. Noah refused to eat. His tiny body suddenly began to burn with fever, and his skin turned the pallor of porcelain. The pediatrician wasted no time. He sent us straight to the emergency room, and an hour later, we were standing in the hallway of the neonatal intensive care unit, listening to the clicking of machines around us, measuring our son's breathing. The monitors flashed green, the doctors spoke quietly, as if in a church. Someone was saying words I didn't understand then. Metabolic disorders, mutations, enzyme deficiencies. It all sounded like a death sentence in a foreign language. But the worst part wasn't the day Noah died. The most painful memory wasn't his death, but the moment 2 days before it. We were sitting in a small room smelling of disinfectant, with posters about chromosomes and heredity hanging on the walls, and the genetic counselor was gently but firmly explaining that my son had a rare recessive disease passed down through my family. I watched Thomas listen, and then quietly, his hand slipped from mine like a snake in the grass. His face froze, his lips pressed into a thin line, and then, for the first time, I understood that love can die not with a scream, but in silence. In the hallway, as I sobbed, pressed against the cold wall, he said, "It's you. You have defective genes. You killed him." For 7 years, I lived with these words like a death sentence. For 7 years, I carried them inside me like a stone in my chest. Every child I saw, every mother rocking her baby in the park, every photo online of someone holding a newborn, all of it whispered the same thing to me. You killed him. I believed it because I had no strength left not to believe. And then that Tuesday came. The phone rang, breaking the familiar silence, and I heard the voice of Dr. Marco Verdi, the new head of the lab. "Miss Fellini," she said, "your son did not have a genetic disease. Someone killed him." I froze, not immediately understanding the meaning of the words. "What?" I whispered. We found records, videos. This person has a name and access to the neonatal unit. You need to come." And then I learned the truth. The woman who once doubted whether I was worthy of her son, the one who greeted me with a forced smile and told me my last name was too simple to be Fellini's. It was she who injected poison into my child's IV while I slept next to her, exhausted from sleepless nights. Wanda Girardi, the epitome of decorum and cold perfection, the owner of a perfect hairdo and keys to every department, murdered my 3-week-old son. But then, on that Tuesday afternoon, I didn't know any of this. I stood in my modest apartment above the bakery, holding the phone to my ear, surrounded by the scent of freshly baked bread, a smell that always brought comfort. The world seemed to tilt, as if the ground beneath my feet had lost its footing. Dr. Verdi repeated, "Please come. There's something you need to see." For 7 years after Noah's death, I lived alone. A small apartment on the south side of Chicago, the smell of coffee and bread in the morning, all I had left. The furniture collected from classified ads, disjointed but honest. Nothing in common with Fellini's Victorian house, where sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows and cast iridescent patches on the walls of the nursery, painted a soft yellow. That Tuesday began like any other. I woke up at 6, made coffee in an old blue mug left over from the divorce, and finally decided to open the box of photographs I'd kept in my closet for 7 years, like an urn containing my past. Dr. Monica Ria, my therapist, had often said, "You can't heal from a wound unless you look at it." I sat down at the small table, pulled out the first photograph, and the world stopped. Thomas and I were standing on the pier. He was hugging my belly. I was laughing, and the sun falling on the water reflected in his eyes. We seemed so happy, so confident that a life without loss lay ahead. His hand rested on the spot where Noah's heart was beating, mine on top of his. Back then, I thought we were one. Now I know. In that moment, he no longer belonged to me, but to his mother. The next photograph was worse. Noah, just a day old, slept in the hospital crib, his tiny fist pressed to his cheek, and I looked at him as if that photo could keep him alive, because in those first days, I had already instinctively photographed everything: the folds of his neck, the tiny nails, the warm curve of his ear, as if I had a premonition that one day I would need proof of his existence. His hair was dark, like Thomas's, and the nurses had said back then that everything could change, but we would never know, because sometimes facts fade before the memory we want to believe. "They say time heals all things," I said to the empty room, and the phrase echoed familiarly, because years of loneliness had made me a master at masking my own pain. I had learned to hide the wound beneath a layer of mundane activities. Working at the bookstore, appointments with the therapist, rare dinners with Camilla. I worked part-time at Chapters and Verses, where Lucrezia gave me refuge and asked no questions. And on Saturdays, I hid in the back room, hearing the children's laughter and feeling that multicolored sound sting my heart. When customers asked if I had children, I answered briefly, "No, just me." And that smile closed the subject, allowing me to retreat back to the shelves, where the books, faithful and silent companions, asked no questions. At that morning hour, looking at the box of photographs, I allowed myself to remember. Thomas was someone I wasn't. Bold, outgoing, with a last name that opened doors. He painted Noah's future in precise plans: private schools, perhaps Harvard, strict teachers and politics, if the boy showed aptitude, and he told me, "With my grip and your heart, he will conquer the world." And I warmed to these words until Wanda, at the celebration, gave a toast in which the family name sounded like a sign of superiority, and Mom, squeezing my hand under the table, whispered that she would soften when she saw her grandson. Noah was born on a Thursday night, 3 weeks early, 6 pounds 40 ounces, perfect in his tiny, imperfect way. And when the doctor placed him on my chest, Thomas cried real tears. "He's perfect, look what we've done, Amelia," he said. And those first 11 days were like a long, sweet dream. The first diaper changes, the first bath, the first time home. Thomas took a vacation, and our Victorian house was filled with their whispers and quiet promises. Wanda would come in holding Noah with the expected efficiency, adjusting the blanket and criticizing my breastfeeding technique. But she might seem softer in the cradle, and I naively thought she would soften completely until the 12th day turned our world upside down. Noah's cry became more than just a demand for food. His body was ablaze with fever, and the pediatrician's care turned into a continuous fuss and a fight for minutes in the ward, because the transformation was so sudden that at times it seemed to me as if those first 11 days were just an illusion. One morning, in that brief, tremulous time when Thomas and I were getting used to the word parents, we were arguing over trivial matters, whether Noah had mine, slightly upturned, or Thomas's straight. I teased him, saying our son was a miniature version of his mother, and laughed as the sun slid across the curtains, painting the room gold. But by evening, that laughter had turned to dead silence as I stood over the incubator, listening to the machine's beeps piercingly hammer out a pain beyond words. That day, I placed a photograph of Noah as a newborn, the one where he's asleep, his fist pressed to his cheek, next to the pile, and picked up the last one, Thomas and me on our wedding day. We stood under an arch of white roses, my hair brushing his face, his hand on my waist, and behind us, like a shadow, stood Wanda, in a dark blue dress, her face devoid of joy or blessing. Even in this photo, she seemed to be watching, assessing, calculating how to manage our future. The coffee grew cold in my blue mug, and outside the window Chicago was waking up, a city that knew no peace. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, bakery doors opened below, the smell of bread rising, mingling with the chill of the morning. Life went on, indifferent to my losses. I had learned to find solace in this steady rhythm, in the repetition of days that demanded nothing but presence. 4 more hours, and Dr. Marco Verdi would call me, shattering this fragile silence in which I hid myself. Her voice will change everything, every memory, every glance at a photograph, every breath taken under the weight of guilt. But that morning, I was simply Amelia Fellini, a 38-year-old woman, divorced, childless, looking at photographs of a past life and holding a snapshot of the boy she couldn't save. Back then, I believed my guilt was my repentance, that my isolation was a just punishment, and that the silence over the bakery was the only thing I deserved. The truth, when it comes, will be far more terrible, and at the same time purer than the lie I'd lived for 7 years. But for now, I simply stroked my finger over the photograph of my son and whispered what I whispered every morning. "Forgive me, my baby. Mommy, forgive me." The deterioration began on March 23rd, an ordinary morning like thousands of others. I woke up at 6, looked at the clock, noticed that Noah was sleeping a little longer than usual, and thought his schedule had gotten off track. I remember the smell of warm milk mingling with the spring chill, and it seemed like a minor detail. But by midday, the alarm had become palpable. His temperature had risen, his skin had flushed like fine porcelain, and I was rushing between the thermometer and the acetaminophen drops the pediatrician had prescribed over the phone. "Babies get fevers, Amelia," she said calmly. "If it doesn't go down by evening, come back." But by evening, it didn't go down. It only rose. By the time Thomas rushed home from work, Noah was already flushed. His breathing had become short and shallow, and I saw my husband's lips twitch for the first time, not from sympathy, but from fear. His loud, demanding cries had turned into weak sobs, as if he were trying to breathe through an invisible wall. And the moment I held him in my arms, I knew something in the world had irreversibly changed. Riverside General, the hospital where we found ourselves, became a cage for us, where time stretched and compressed simultaneously. We sat under the cold glow of monitors, where each flash meant a heartbeat, each number a hope. The doctor spoke rapidly, using words that sounded like incantations: metabolic acidosis, mitochondrial dysfunction, enzyme deficiency. Thomas, accustomed to being in control, began asking questions with an intensity worthy of a conference room, not an intensive care unit. On the third day, Dr. Matilda Champy, tired with eyes the color of green glass, uttered a phrase that split my world into before and after. We need to run genetic tests. She explained softly that some defects only manifest after birth, that the stress of adaptation can trigger a malfunction, but I no longer heard. I simply watched Noah's breath flicker on the screen like a line and prayed it wouldn't stop. I spent 2 weeks in that chair, motionless, sleepless, barely alive. Thomas came and went, as if his presence were a ritual he performed less and less frequently. At first, he held my hand, asked the doctor pointed questions, insisted on changes in treatment. But when the first test results came back, everything changed. Maria, the soft-spoken genetic counselor, said she saw signs of a rare autosomal recessive syndrome requiring both parents to carry the defective gene. Thomas immediately asked, "From the same family tree?" And Maria nodded, clarifying that it was only a possibility, not a fact. Then his tone turned icy. "My family is documented for 5 generations," he said, as if protecting his lineage from shame. "All the records are in place, no genetic diseases." The moment our marriage died didn't coincide with Noah's death. It happened 3 days earlier, in a stuffy conference room that smelled of paper and disinfectant, where chromosome maps hung on the walls like geographical maps of our destinies. Maria, reserved and gentle, had just finished explaining how this disease could be transmitted through recessive genes hidden deep within generations, like invisible cracks in glass that sooner or later become a fault. And then Thomas turned to me, and for the first time, there was neither love nor pity in his gaze, only a calculating coldness. "Your cousin Jennifer," he said suddenly, as if he'd fired a shot. "The one who died at 17. You said it was a car accident." I froze, unsure what he was getting at. "It was a car accident," I said, feeling my cheeks heat up. "But she was sick before, wasn't she?" he continued with grim insistence. "Your aunt at our wedding said she was frail, that she had some kind of chronic fatigue syndrome." "This has nothing to do with Noah, Thomas. How did you even—" But he interrupted, his voice like a sharp slap across the face. "How should I know? Because you know nothing yourself. You don't even know the names of your biological parents, let alone your grandparents. You don't know what diseases run in your blood. And now our son is dying because of something you don't know." The words fell between us like a blade. I opened my mouth to protest, but at that moment Wanda walked in. She always showed up just when the tension reached a boiling point, as if she sensed where she could take control. That evening, she arrived from Lake Forest immediately after Thomas's call and burst into the department as if it were her own home. Her white coat, unfamiliar yet perfectly tailored, gave her the air of a woman who couldn't be contradicted. She studied Noah's medical records, questioned the nurses, talked to the doctors, and then, when she thought I couldn't hear, she pulled Thomas aside, their conversations cutting off whenever I approached. "We need a second opinion," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. "I know the head of genetics at Northwestern University. He owes me a favor." But there was no time. Noah's kidneys were failing, and tests showed signs of liver damage. Dr. Raymond Park, a short Korean man with a tired look, delivered his verdict softly, as if there was kindness in it, but every word hit the chest like a stone. Organic acidemia. Without the necessary enzymes, his body can't process certain proteins, and toxins accumulate in the blood. Sometimes, if diagnosed early, such children live for years. But in your case, the disease started too early. He won't survive. These words sounded like a death sentence. Thomas didn't speak right away, but when he looked up, I saw something in them finally break. "Your defective genes are killing our son," he said evenly, almost matter-of-factly, as if signing a death warrant. The air grew thick. Even the nurse setting up the IV held her breath and turned away. "Thomas, please," I whispered. "It's not anyone's fault. Genetic defects happen. No one can— No, he interrupted abruptly. They don't just happen. They're passed down, from people who weren't supposed to have children. He paused, but the meaning was clear. People like me. My mother was right, he added, and I heard the icy certainty in his voice. She wanted me to insist on a full checkup before the wedding. She warned me that your unknown past was a liability, and I protected you. I told you that love was enough, that it didn't matter, and now my son dies because of my weakness. Our son, I whispered, feeling the words crumble on my lips. He is our son, Thomas. No, he said, tugging on his tie, as if he were going to a board meeting and not burying a child. He dies because of your genes, because of your family, because of your unwillingness to understand yourself before you decided to have children. He left, and I knew that the Thomas I once loved, the man who read stories to children and cried, holding Noah in his arms on his birthday, would never return. His body would still be here, at the incubator, at the funeral, at the coffin. But I no longer had a husband. In the following days, everything merged into a continuous stream of pain. Thomas consulted with lawyers while our son barely breathed, moved into the guest room of our house, and I was left alone, in the hospital by the crib where my child was slowly dying. Wanda would bring me food I couldn't eat, sit next to me, and say in a level voice, "This is terrible for Thomas. Do you understand? Knowing his perfect son died because of something that could have been prevented." "What do you mean?" I asked. "If only you'd been honest about your genetic uncertainty." I looked up at her. I was honest. I told Thomas I was adopted. I didn't hide anything. Wanda smiled slightly, coldly, tiredly, like a doctor drawing a conclusion after a botched operation. "Omission is also a lie, dear. You should have given up your children knowing you don't know who you really are." And in that moment, I understood. They, mother and son, were always on the same side, and I was just a mistake in their perfect family tree. What risks? I wanted to scream. About the risk of being human, about the risk of loving and losing, about the risk of trusting a body that sometimes fails, about the risk of life itself, where there are no guarantees, where every joy is a coin tossed into a fountain with an unknown outcome. But I remained silent, because Noah was dying, and in that moment everything else ceased to make sense. Conversations, resentments, even love. When, at 3:47 a.m. on April 6th, the monitor beeped long and then died away, and the red line on the screen slowly straightened, Thomas was in chapel, Wanda was in the cafeteria, and I sat next to him, holding my son's tiny hand, growing colder with each passing minute. I stroked his fingers and whispered incoherent words, apologies, promises, confessions, all that was left to a woman who had lost her heart. I apologized for failing him, for my stupid, broken genes, failing to give him the life he deserved. I think I promised him that Mom would still love him, despite her damaged blood, despite all the things Thomas said about my tainted nature, despite everything. The funeral took place in Lake Forest, in the church where Wanda sang in the choir and knew the priest by name. Everything was perfect. The white lilies, the rustling organ, the hushed voices of those who came to offer condolences, unsure where to look. Thomas delivered a speech, impeccable, rehearsed, as if he were delivering it not over his son's tiny coffin, but at a shareholders' meeting. He spoke of lost hopes, of unfulfilled dreams, of a love that couldn't conquer fate. He never looked at me, never once said the word "we." The next day, a courier delivered the divorce papers. They all read like a formality. Irreconcilable differences, emotional damage, impossibility of continuing the marriage. Thomas's lawyer, a clean-shaven man with cold eyes named Antonio Blackwood, explained everything to me in his oak-paneled office, filled with the scent of expensive coffee. Given the tragic circumstances and your role in transmitting a genetic disorder, Mr. Fellini is entitled to compensation for emotional distress, he said, almost tenderly, as if discussing the details of a charitable foundation. However, my client is willing to drop the lawsuit if you sign these documents. I read the terms. They took everything from me. The house that still smelled of Noah, the savings we'd put aside for his education, even the car I'd driven to the hospital that March morning. Everything. I signed because it no longer mattered. Why fight when your child is dead and your husband believes you were the cause of his death? I remember signing the document as if someone else's hand were moving across the paper, and how Antonio, without looking, carefully tucked the contract into a leather folder, saying, "You did the right thing." For 7 years, I lived like a shadow, working in a bookstore, rare visits to my sister Camilla, therapy on Saturdays. Everything was simple, almost sterile. I learned not to look at babies, not to listen to children's laughter, not to open old albums. But that Tuesday, at precisely 2:17 p.m., the past again cut through the present like a knife. The phone vibrated as it hit the counter. The number was local but unfamiliar. I almost ignored the call, thinking it was another notice about the overdue medical bills I was still paying, a memory of Noah's last days. "Miss Fellini?" A female voice, confident, polite, with a slight Italian intonation. "Is this Amelia Fellini?" "Yes," I replied, moving to the window. "Who's speaking?" "My name is Dr. Marco Verdi. I'm the chief of pediatrics at Riverside General Hospital. We need to discuss the case of your son, Noah Fellini." For a moment, I didn't understand the words. The words fell like raindrops on glass, unfocused. "What?" I whispered. "Noah died 7 years ago." "Yes, Miss Fellini, I'm aware." My voice remained soft, but there was tension beneath it. "That's why I'm calling. We've discovered significant discrepancies in his medical records. This requires your personal presence." "Discrepancies," I repeated, feeling a chill run down my spine. Lucretia, standing by the coffee machine, gave me an anxious glance, and I turned away. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person," Dr. Verdi added. "Can you be here in an hour? I'll clear my schedule." There was such urgency in her voice that my instinctive desire to never set foot in that hospital again gave way to something else, a mixture of fear and necessity. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said, and hung up. I told Lucretia I had a family matter, put on my jacket, grabbed my bag, and drove off. The car seemed to be driving itself. Everything around me, the streets, the signs, even the wind, seemed to know where I was going. Riverside General greeted me the same way it had 7 years ago. 12 floors of brown brick, shiny windows, the smell of hand sanitizer, and the same creaking elevator between the 3rd and 4th floors. Dr. Verdi was waiting for me at the reception desk, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind glasses and a face reflecting heavy knowledge. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, and led me not to her office but to a conference room on the administrative floor. The room was empty, with a long table, a glass wall, and a view of the parking lot. But I wasn't the first one in there. 2 men were already seated at the desk. One was in a dark suit with a briefcase at his feet and an expression of discreet concern, clearly a lawyer. The other was broad-shouldered, with a bearing that suggested a career, perhaps in the police. "Miss Fellini," said Dr. Verdi, coughing slightly. "This is Germano Carrera, the hospital's legal counsel, and Detective Vitale Caruso of the Chicago Police Department." Silence fell over the room. I felt a chill rise from the floor, as if a subterranean wind were blowing through the building. Then Detective Caruso, looking directly at me, said quietly, "Miss Fellini, we need to ask you a few questions about your son's death." "Police?" I sank into the offered chair. "Police," I repeated silently, because the detective's voice was unlike the ones that accompanied my nightmares, and I felt the chair supporting me less than my memory. Dr. Verdi placed her hands on the thick folder and spoke calmly. "Miss Fellini, 3 months ago we began digitizing medical records, and during the review we discovered discrepancies in documents dating back 7 years, including your son's case." She opened the folder, and I saw familiar pages, crumpled notes, handwritten notes, but next to them were sheets I'd never seen before. Verdi continued, The genetic test results attributed to Noah weren't his. They were taken from another child who was being treated in our department at the time and survived. I grabbed the edge of the table as the world rocked. "What are you saying?" I choked out. Detective Caruso finally intervened. "We found abnormally high levels of potassium chloride in Noah's blood samples. That concentration shouldn't occur naturally in the disease. It could only have been injected." My voice cracked. "Injected?" "Yes," he said. "Someone administered a lethal dose." The word "killed" hung in the air, and I felt it not as a sound but as a blow to the chest. "Who?" I whispered, and the answer didn't come right away because everyone in the room seemed wary of breaking down another wall in my life. Caruso explained that when the video footage from the ward was being digitized, the night camera had captured a figure in a medical uniform, and the footage showed the person walking straight to Noah's incubator, preparing a syringe and injecting the medication. Verdi turned on the laptop, and we watched the grainy black and white video time-stamped to April 6th, around 3 a.m. The footage showed a figure, precise movements, the way her shoulders were held, and for a split second she looked directly into the camera. I recognized that gait. I quietly muttered, "That's Wanda." Detective Caruso nodded. Wanda Girardi, a former nurse and volunteer on the pediatric ward, had access and knew where the camera blind spots were. She had codes and privileges that allowed her to be near the babies at night. I felt the shock and betrayal so acutely that my throat went dry. "Why her?" I asked, and Dr. Verdi carefully pulled out another batch of documents, placing them on the table. "We also received the results of Thomas's genetic test," she said. "He carries a marker for Huntington's disease, a dominant mutation. The risk of passing it on to his child was 50%. The image formed in my mind like a terrifying collage. Wanda, obsessed with the purity of her family heritage, having learned of the risk, could perceive it as a threat to the future of the Fellini line and make a terrible decision. I looked at the photo of Noah still in my bag and suddenly realized that 7 years had wrapped me in a chain of lies, and that this chain wasn't simply the result of a medical error. It was a human act, carefully concealed behind a mask of concern. Moments came flooding back. The way Wanda's eyes swept over me at family dinners, the way she'd made comments about the order in the house, the way her words tinged with intolerance for any impurity in the family line. I recalled her fingers adjusting Noah's silk blanket, her cold advice about tests, her impatience with me on the days when I'd begged for a little mercy. All of it now had a motivation both sinister and clear. My thoughts raced, and I realized I needed to know the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. I whispered, "She knew," and the words were thick with guilt, bitterness, and the realization that betrayal could be cloaked in care. She knew about Thomas's Huntington's disease marker. We found evidence that she did indeed gain access to his medical records, Dr. Verdi said, and the words made my stomach freeze. "Illegally, through her connections among the nurses." Detective Caruso nodded in confirmation. "We believe," he said evenly without unnecessary emotion, "that she decided to eliminate evidence of Fellini's genetic defect and instead shift the blame onto you." He extended his hand, and Dr. Verdi slid another sheet of paper across the table, now bearing the insurance company's stamp. "This is a life insurance policy issued to Noah just 2 days after his birth. The beneficiary was your husband, Thomas. The payout is $500,000, but only in the event of death caused by the genetic disorder." I felt the words pierce the air between us like thin but inexorable needles. 500,000. That's how much it took to buy himself a new life, erasing the old one like a failed draft. Thomas used the money to start his own distribution company, which now bore his name like a symbol of rebirth, though in reality it was built on death. He entered Chicago high society, bought a new home in Lincoln Park, married a second time, published photographs from lavish receptions, and touching snapshots of twin boys beaming against a perfectly manicured lawn. They would never know that somewhere in the past there had been another boy, their brother, sacrificed to their grandmother's pride and their father's ambition. Detective Caruso looked at me with a long, heavy gaze. "Miss Fellini," he said, "we need your consent to make arrests." I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, but the words formed themselves. "Yes." He nodded. "We have enough evidence to charge Wanda Girardi with murder and Thomas Fellini with conspiracy if it's confirmed he knew." I remained silent, feeling the past bearing down on me. 7 years of pain, doubt, self-recrimination. 7 years of therapy, learning to breathe without tears. 7 years until my sister Camilla allowed me to touch her children, just in case. 7 years since my mother stopped celebrating birthdays because she couldn't look at candles without remembering the child who was no longer there. 7 years since Thomas readily told anyone who would listen that my defective genes had killed his son. I took a deeper breath than the pain allowed and said, "Arrest them both." My voice sounded firm, almost calm, unlike it had in years. Everything else happened quickly, with the precision of a military operation. Detective Caruso personally coordinated the arrests. Wanda was to be apprehended on Tuesday evening during a book club meeting at her country club in Lake Forest, and Thomas right at a work meeting in his office, surrounded by those who idolized him as a paragon of success. The timing was carefully chosen, public enough to prevent them from escaping, yet controlled enough to avoid a scandal. I waited in a small room at the police station, furnished only with a table, 2 chairs, and a clock on the wall, its hands creeping towards 6 o'clock. Dr. Verdi remained with me. The same woman who had returned my son to me, at least in truth, if not in reality. She sat across from me and suddenly said quietly, without looking at me, "That's not all, Miss Fellini." I looked up. This afternoon, during a warrant search, we found a search history on Wanda's personal computer. She'd been researching potassium chloride for weeks before Noah was born. And she wasn't just reading about it. She was researching dosages, administration routes, detection methods. She was preparing. Those words sank into my mind like lead. I remembered how we'd chosen a crib together, how she'd suggested not overloading the baby, how her smile was a little colder than a grandmother's should have been. My mother-in-law didn't just despise my blood. She was looking for a way to erase its trace. Caruso entered carrying a box labeled Evidence. He pulled out a leather notebook worn at the corners. "We've found her diaries," he said. "We need you to recognize the handwriting." I recognized it immediately. The crisp, elegant slant. The letters that oozed confidence. "March 10th, the detective read. "Thomas's results confirmed. Huntington's disease marker present. 50% for any offspring." This can't be Fellini's legacy. Alternative solutions must be considered. He turned the page. March 15th. Amelia's family history provides the perfect cover. Closed adoption, no traceable links. If anything happens, the blame will naturally fall on her bloodline. Then another entry. March 20th. Thomas doesn't know the results, and let him never know. His confidence is his strength. If he knew the truth, it would destroy him. I stared at the lines, and the letters blurred before my eyes, as if the paper itself couldn't bear the weight of these confessions. Each entry was worse than the last, as if the paper itself couldn't hold so much malice and self-righteous calculation, saturated with the cold poison of words that held no remorse. She wrote about watching me hold Noah to my breast and how long she would have to wait before acting. She watched me in the NICU, describing my exhaustion as if it were part of the plan, not a mother's pain. She noted the times I fell asleep in the chair, as if counting the minutes convenient for the murder. And then, the rehearsal. She rehearsed her reaction to Noah's death. Shocked, but not hysterical. Maintained Thomas's anger at Amelia. I couldn't read those lines without a metallic taste in my mouth. At that moment, Detective Caruso's phone rang. The time was 6:23 p.m. He listened for a few seconds, then nodded curtly. Girardi is in custody. Fellini, too. Bring them both in for questioning. The rest passed in a strange, viscous silence, as if time no longer obeyed its usual laws. Wanda was brought in first. She entered the building in handcuffs, but with the same high chin, in her impeccable cream-colored mother-of-pearl suit, her perfectly coiffed gray hair, the same expression she once wore when greeting guests at dinner parties. I saw her through the one-way glass of the interrogation room, cold, reserved, commanding until the very end. Half an hour later, Thomas was brought in. His rage was palpable from a distance, abrupt movements, shouting, cursing. "This is insanity," he screamed. "My mother, Amelia, would never do this. They're wrong." The first time he'd spoken my name in 7 years sounded almost blasphemous. I watched as the man who had taken everything from me cling to the remnants of his world, oblivious to it crumbling beneath his hands. Detective Caruso gestured for me to enter the observation room. Behind the glass was Wanda with her lawyer, a confident man in an expensive suit. Caruso sat across from me and turned on the recorder. "Mrs. Girardi, we have video footage showing you entering the neonatal intensive care unit at 3:47 a.m. on April 6th. We know you accessed potassium chloride using your volunteer pass. We have your search queries, your notes, your diaries. Is there anything you'd like to explain?" Wanda adjusted her pearl necklace, just as she always did before saying something sarcastic, and said calmly, "My grandson suffered. The genetic disorder he inherited from his mother was causing him agony. What I did was an act of mercy." My hands shook, but Caruso remained unmoved. He spread the test results out before her. "These are Noah's actual results. Perfect. No abnormalities. Not a single genetic anomaly." For the first time in all the time I'd known Wanda, her face faltered. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. The realization that her plan had been discovered pierced the armor of her confidence. "It's impossible," she whispered, as if to herself. "It's impossible that you would kill a healthy baby to hide your son's Huntington's disease," Caruso said calmly, comparing the genetic data of Thomas and Noah. "You killed your grandson, Mrs. Girardi, because you couldn't bear the thought of the Fellini name no longer being perfect." The lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she brushed it off sharply, as if tired of the pretense. When she spoke again, her voice held the same imperious steel with which she had once reprimanded the cooks and criticized my table setting. "You don't understand what it means to create something great," she said. "The Hartwell name, its reputation, its legacy, the work of generations. Thomas must be strong, confident, brilliant. I couldn't let him know he was broken. I couldn't let the world know the Fellini line was tainted." Caruso leaned forward. "So instead, you decided to ruin Amelia's life?" he asked. Wanda looked straight into the camera, right where I was standing, and said with icy calm, "She was a nobody. A librarian from an unknown family. Her suffering was nothing compared to preserving the Fellini line. Her pain gave Thomas strength. He needed to know who to blame." I looked at the woman who had just confessed to murdering my child with the same indifferent tone with which she had previously discussed the color of my wedding roses. Not a shred of remorse, not a single crack in that granite of vanity. Thomas was questioned later. He was breaking down. His world had crumbled in an instant. When confronted with his mother's confession, his own test results, and the insurance policy, he went limp, like a man suddenly deprived of his footing. "I didn't know," he repeated over and over. "She said the insurance was just a precaution. I believed her. I've always believed her." Detective Caruso showed no sympathy. He looked directly at Wanda and said calmly, "You took the insurance money. You built your company on your son's death. I thought this was compensation for the pain I had to endure because of genetics, Amelia. And what about Amelia's pain?" His words were sobering, and first shock arose in my chest, then the long-awaited rush of hot truth. For 7 years, I believed I had killed my child. Thomas, looking through the glass, saw not me, but the ghost of the life we shared. For a moment, I recognized him as the man I'd married, the one who cried at Noah's birth. But then his lawyer walked into the room, and the walls went up again. Formality, coldness, and calculation. The grand jury indicted within a week. Wanda for first-degree murder, Thomas for insurance fraud and conspiracy. They couldn't prove his prior knowledge of the murder, but his subsequent actions, his cruelty to me and profiting from my son's death, painted a picture of complicity. The court called us back in 6 months, preparation time to present the truth and convict those responsible. That evening, I called Camille. He didn't die because of my genes. He was murdered. I need our family back, I said. The answer was sobs, apologies, and a 7-year estrangement that crumbled along with her pleas for forgiveness. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. 6 months of testimony and documents led to the moment when the judge announced the verdict. Wanda was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. Thomas received 25 years for fraud and conspiracy because emails were found discussing insurance and ways to manage the situation around my genetic guilt. He may not have known about the injection beforehand, but afterward, he enthusiastically participated in my destruction. The court asked if the victim's mother wished to speak. I stood. Camilla and my mother were quietly crying in the front row. Lucrezia, Dr. Verdi, and to my surprise, Thomas's new wife sat behind me. For 7 years, I believed I killed my son, I said evenly, my voice unwavering for the first time in so many years. I lost my home, my marriage, my job, and the right to grieve without stigma. While I carried the guilt, the true criminal went to balls and enjoyed life. I turned to Wanda. You killed Noah for the family name, but Noah was perfect because he was loved. That's the greatest legacy. Her face remained hard, but Thomas wept, finally feeling the magnitude of his loss and his guilt. After the verdict, Camilla, my mother, and I walked out into the fresh air, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt the taste of guilt disappear from my mouth. Breathing gave me back some purpose. Journalists surrounded us. When asked what I wanted people to know, I answered directly to the camera. Mother's intuition is real. I knew something was wrong, but I allowed doctors and loud voices to convince me to doubt myself. If your heart tells you the truth is hidden, keep looking for answers. The truth can be terrible, but it's better than living a lie. The settlement from the hospital's insurance company and the civil suit against Fellini's heirs totaled $3 million. And I sat for a long time in the kitchen, staring out the window where the evening light slowly slid across my cup of cold coffee, wondering what I could buy with money mined from someone else's greed and my own pain. Ultimately, I decided that at least part of it had to be put to good use. Otherwise, all of Noah's suffering would have been in vain. I donated 1/3 to the Innocence Project because I now knew what it was like to be accused of a crime you didn't commit. That feeling when the world turns its back, when the truth becomes a shadow, and your name is whispered like a curse. Another 1/3 went to the creation of the Noah Fellini Foundation, an organization where families facing real genetic diseases could receive counseling and testing without fear of their love being measured by the percentage of hereditary defects. I spent the remaining 1/3 on a small house in Oak Park with a garden where roses bloom in the spring, and every year on Noah's birthday, the first buds open as if he were greeting me from afar. I returned to work, but now I was helping other parents who had experienced loss, telling them what I had once so desperately longed to hear myself, that tragedy isn't always accidental, but it's also not always someone's fault, and that healing comes only with the truth, no matter how painful. Dr. Monica Ria, my therapist, asked me during my last session, "How do you feel about forgiveness?" I paused for a long time before answering. I don't forgive Wanda. There are some things you can't forgive, just as you can't resurrect a child. She killed for pride, but I've forgiven myself, and that's enough. On the mantelpiece sits a single photograph, Noah, 3 days old, asleep, wrapped in a blanket, seemingly perfect. Under the photo was a caption, "Noah Fellini, 3 weeks of life, a lifetime of love. Your truth set Mom free." One day, I received a letter from Thomas from prison, long, rambling, full of self-pity. He wrote about Huntington's disease, about fear, about remorse. He asked for forgiveness, but I couldn't give it. For 7 years, he allowed the world to consider me a murderer, building his well-being on his son's grave, and no tears, even the most sincere, could wash away that shame. His twin sons, Gianluca and Andrew, visit me once a month. Melissa brings them. We look at old photographs together. I tell them stories about Noah, and they listen as if it were a fairy tale, where good doesn't always win, but always remains honest. They know they had a brother who died, and one day I will tell them the whole truth, not to hurt them, but to protect them, so they will never believe those who claim a person's worth is determined by their genes and not their hearts. The last time I visited Noah's grave, I brought a letter. I wrote about everything that happened, about the pain, about the judgment, about how his name became a symbol of truth. I read it aloud at his tombstone and then burned the letter, watching 7 years of fear turn to ashes, the wind blowing the lies away, leaving only clear sky. "You were never broken, baby," I whispered, "and neither am I." Some stories don't have happy endings, but they do have endings, and sometimes that's enough. Noah can't be brought back, but justice can be brought back, and the right to breathe without guilt can be reclaimed. That's the power of truth. It doesn't heal, it sets you free. After 7 years in a prison of lies, freedom smells like spring, fresh earth, and roses blooming at dawn. I think Noah would want me to be free, to know that love is stronger than genetics, truth is stronger than fear, and a mother's heart can survive even the most brutal loss. His 3 weeks of life meant more than an eternity of deception, because he was loved. His story deserved to be told, and now it has become not just my memory, but a light that perhaps will help other mothers not give up.